The scream came from somewhere beyond the rusted line of vehicles, low at first, then rising, stretching into something ragged and impossible. It didn't sound human. But it also didn't sound entirely inhuman. Specialist Robert froze where he stood, one boot halfway through the open gate, the other still planted on solid gravel. In that single, breathless moment, the night folded inward like a collapsing lung. His flashlight dropped slightly in his grip. The beam danced erratically across the outlines of decaying sedans and military jeeps from wars long past. Nothing moved. And yet, everything felt aware. Another scream, closer this time. It tore through the darkness with a raw, wet edge, like metal on bone. Behind him, the truck's headlights cut wide beams through the fence, casting long shadows that twitched and stretched over twisted heaps of forgotten machinery. Robert's partner, Wireman, was out of the truck now too, standing frozen, one hand resting on the grip of his sidearm. Then something stood up. Robert didn't see it rise, he felt it. Felt the shift in the air. Felt the hum of mass and intent, the way a deer must feel the breath of the mountain lion a heartbeat before the strike. His eyes locked onto it, a figure silhouetted against a wrecked Humvee, waist level to the vehicle's roof. It had form. Height. Presence. But it wasn't the size that paralyzed him, it was the way it stood. Too still. Too straight. And then it charged. Robert's body caught up before his mind. He spun, boots crunching gravel, and stumbled toward the truck. Behind him, metal shrieked as something tore through the lot, too fast, too loud, too much. Wireman was shouting something, maybe his name, maybe a curse, but the words didn't register. The thing was chasing them. A few moments later, the truck skidded onto the road, tires screaming. The headlights surged forward, washing the tree line in yellow haze. For one split second, Robert turned his head to look out the passenger window. And it was there. Running. Not stumbling. Not lurching. Running. 10 feet away, on the other side of the fence, something huge was pacing the truck. Legs pumping like pistons, a thick torso hunched forward with unnatural balance, its eyes locked onto Robert's. No reflection. No fear. Just a wide, strange intelligence, and a mouth that opened just enough to show teeth. It made a sound, not a roar, not a growl. A grunt. Measured. Controlled. Then it leapt. 12 feet of steel fence folded beneath its weight like paper. For a moment, all Robert could see in the side mirror was a tangle of limbs, barbed wire, and heaving breath. Then it disappeared behind them. Silence returned, but the night never felt empty again. Years later, Robert would still hear that scream in his sleep. He would still drive past tree lines and check his rearview mirror, waiting to see eye shine that never came. And he would still ask himself the same question, over and over again. What if it hadn't stumbled? What if it had wanted to catch them? What would the army have said then? And what else, deep in the forests of Fort Campbell, might still be waiting for someone to open the wrong gate? Cue intro theme or fade in narration. This is the story of a forgotten stretch of military backroad. And what two soldiers may have seen there one night in 1988. A story that was never reported. Never confirmed. And never fully explained. Pause. Welcome to Fort Campbell's darkest secret. You've probably never heard of Fort Campbell. It doesn't get the press coverage of Fort Bragg or the legacy of Camp Pendleton. Tucked away along the border of Kentucky and Tennessee, it's a place you only really know if you've served, or if you've lived in its shadow. Back in 1987, Specialist Robert was just glad to be home. Born and raised in Tennessee, he knew the kind of woods that pressed in on the base's perimeter. He knew the smell of pine after rain, the hum of insects in the summer, and the kind of silence that could fall so hard it made your ears ring. To him, Fort Campbell wasn't ominous. It was familiar. Robert had just returned from a short, hot, thankless deployment to Central America, the kind of assignment that left more questions than medals. He expected some downtime, maybe a return to his core specialty, communications. Instead, he was reassigned to security detail under the MP battalion. A temporary thing, they said. Just helping out. Pulling night shifts. Guarding storage buildings, patrolling the outer fence, keeping an eye out for drunk soldiers, love-struck barracks brats, or bored vandals with a can of spray paint. Simple work. Uneventful. But that's not how it turned out. What no one told Robert when he stepped back onto that base, what no one ever tells you, is that Fort Campbell isn't just a sprawl of barracks and airstrips. It's a city-sized mass of deep forest, dirt trails, and abandoned corners. Over 164 square miles of wilderness, pockmarked with forgotten buildings, rusting equipment, and roads that don't appear on maps. Most people on base never see that side of it. Robert did. And then some. He didn't think much of it, at first. Riding shotgun in a military green pickup with his partner wireman behind the wheel, the scent of diesel and tobacco in the cab, the windows down to let the humid air roll in. Long stretches of road, darkness so deep you couldn't see the trees, just the sense of them, rising around you. A flashlight in one hand, a clipboard in the other. Stop. Check the gate. Rattle the chain. Move on. It was routine. Until it wasn't. You see, Fort Campbell's outskirts aren't just forgotten, they're avoided. There are places out there that soldiers quietly learn to steer clear of. Not because they're haunted. Not because anyone says anything outright. But because of stories. Because of looks. The kind that pass between two men who've seen something they can't explain but won't ever admit. For Robert, it started with a junk lot. A place where rusted cars sat in rows like tombstones. Some were from the Vietnam era, soldiers who never made it home. Their cars, still waiting. Forgotten by family. Or maybe just left behind on purpose. Tires rotted, glass long gone, interiors filled with mold, wasp nests, and the heavy weight of abandonment. At night, that lot didn't feel like a scrapyard. It felt like a cemetery. And someone, or something, was still walking through it. The army didn't brief you on that part. They didn't talk about the things moving in the trees. The screams that didn't sound quite human. The shapes that stayed in your peripheral vision just long enough to be real, then vanished when you turned your head. Robert didn't believe in monsters. Not then. But he did believe in patterns. In gut instinct. In the feeling that something's wrong, even if you can't explain why. And something at Fort Campbell was very wrong. The night it all began was a quiet one. The kind of quiet you only get in the deep woods, far from the grid, where the only sound is your own engine humming over dirt and gravel, and the occasional screech of an owl too stubborn to sleep. Robert and Wireman were on the back end of a routine perimeter sweep, the kind of patrol no one ever expected to write a report about. Their route took them around the outermost storage lot, past Building 8702 and the old ammo depot, into the parts of Fort Campbell that looked less like a military base and more like an overgrown ruin. Wireman was driving that night. Robert sat in the passenger seat, boots up on the dash, absently tapping the side of his flashlight against his knee. The headlights cut a narrow tunnel through the dark, and beyond that, just blackness. Not the kind you get in cities or suburbs, but true dark. The kind of dark that has weight. They were just coming around the bend near the vehicle storage yard when Wireman hit the brakes. "Wait," he said. His voice was low, tense. "Did you see that?" Robert sat up. "See what?" "Movement. Inside the lot." "The lot. That graveyard of forgotten cars. The one that still had license plates from the 1970s. Where vines grew through cracked windshields, and silence hung over the vehicles like dust on glass." Robert leaned forward, squinting into the dark. For a moment, nothing. Then. There it was. A figure. Low. Moving between the rows of rusted-out sedans and army surplus trucks. Quick, too. Not stumbling like a drunk, or creeping like a kid with a can of spray paint. It was fast. Fluid. And it knew the light. Each time wireman flicked the mounted spotlight toward it, the figure ducked or slipped out of range. It moved like it was anticipating the light before it even hit. Animal? Wireman asked, though his voice held no conviction. Not unless bears learn to duck and weave, Robert muttered. His hand went instinctively to the grip of his sidearm. Protocol said they had to check it out. Possible intruder. Could be vandals. Could be something worse. Drug runners had been caught using old military routes before. Hell, even homeless squatters had been found holed up in long-abandoned maintenance shacks. They pulled the truck off the road near the service gate. Robert hopped out first, keys in hand. His flashlight beam danced over the heavy padlock, now cold and slick with dew. He fumbled through the oversized key ring, standard issue, one for every chain-linked gate in a 100-mile radius. Behind him, the truck's headlights cast long shadows that jittered with every slight movement. Wireman adjusted the spotlight again, sweeping it across the fence line. Robert glanced back as the light flicked over the rusted hoods, the skeletal remains of once useful machines. Nothing moved. Not yet. Click. The padlock finally gave way, the chain clanking loudly against the metal gate. Robert swung it open slowly, the hinge groaning as if protesting the task. That's when the scream hit. It wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something between, long, high-pitched, ragged at the edges like it had been torn from lungs too large for a man. It came from deep inside the lot, echoing off the metal hulls, warping in the dark. Robert froze. So did the air. Everything, every bird, every insect, every leaf on every tree, just stopped. He felt the blood rush from his face. His vision tunneled, the world shrinking to that one sound. Then, another scream. Closer this time. Then a third. Then silence again. Robert backed away from the open gate, his hand trembling as it moved from the key ring to the grip of his sidearm. His eyes darted across the lot, now an ocean of shadows, broken by the occasional glint of rusted chrome or shattered glass. From his left, Wireman's door slammed open. The driver was out now, pistol drawn, sweeping his own flashlight across the darkened lot. Then, motion. It rose from between the cars. Tall. Taller than it should have been. A shape uncoiling like smoke but with muscle, like something that had been crouched and was now standing to its full, impossible height. Its shoulders were broad. Its limbs too long. Its head. Wrong. Elongated. Rounded. It moved with a kind of silent certainty, a predator's calm. Robert took one involuntary step back. Jesus Christ, he whispered. And then it charged. It didn't scream this time. It just ran, closing distance in seconds, barreling through the lot, its movements part human, part other. Robert could hear the rhythm of its breath now, deep, forced, like a furnace bellows. Heavy. Wet. They turned and ran. Back into the truck. Wireman fumbled the keys but got the engine gunned into motion. Gravel kicked up as they swung the vehicle around, headlights bouncing wildly as they fled back onto the road. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. Because as they tore away from the storage yard, the thing was running alongside them, on the other side of the 12-foot fence. Matching their speed. Its dark form shadowed them, 10 feet away, visible in flashes as the spotlight caught its matted fur, its glistening skin. It was taller than the fence. It jumped. Cleared the barbed wire. And when it landed, hard, it kept running. Still watching them. Still tracking them. Eyes forward. Expressionless. No fear. Just intent. It didn't make sense. The size. The speed. The intelligence behind the eyes. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man. It was something else. And it knew they were afraid. Eventually, speed won out. The truck accelerated faster than the thing could follow, and it dropped behind, vanishing into the dark. But the silence left behind wasn't peace. It was something else. It felt like a warning. They didn't speak until they reached the next checkpoint, their voices hushed and uncertain, like they were afraid to break whatever invisible rule had just been set. They didn't file a report. They couldn't. Because what could they possibly say? That they saw a monster? That it chased them? That it laughed? No. They locked that gate again at dawn. Secured the lot like nothing had ever happened. And they never spoke of it officially. But something changed in Robert that night. Something that never quite changed back. It started with a scream. Not the kind that echoes and fades, but one that tears through the night like a blade and stays lodged in your chest long after it's gone. Robert had been mid-step when it hit, halfway through the open gate, his flashlight in one hand, keys in the other, and that shrill, unnatural sound ripping across the darkness. He froze. Everything in him, every instinct, went tight like coiled wire. His body didn't know whether to run or to draw, but his mind screamed one thing: this wasn't right. The scream had come from inside the lot. Inside the darkness, past the sea of rusted-out cars and collapsing sheds. There was a strange echo to it, as though the sound bounced off metal and stone but didn't lose its shape. And then it came again, closer. Not one scream, but two, then three, interwoven cries from multiple throats, as if something out there was calling not just to scare, but to coordinate. Robert's first reaction wasn't fear. It was calculation. How many voices? What angles? How close? It's what the army taught you to do, push the terror aside and do the math. But there was no math for this. Only noise. Only darkness. Wireman had already dropped back into the truck, the driver's door slamming shut as he grabbed the spotlight again and swept it across the interior of the fence. The beam cut through gaps in the chain link like a scalpel, revealing only flashes, a rearview mirror dangling off a wrecked sedan, the warped glass of a shattered windshield, weeds sprouting from busted hoods like rot. Nothing moved. But Robert felt it. A shift in pressure. Like the air had thickened. The quiet between the screams wasn't silence, it was weight. Presence. He backed up slowly, slipping his keys back onto his belt, hand drifting toward his sidearm. The darkness was no longer just dark, it was dense. Charged. He could hear the blood in his ears. Could feel the tremble starting in his knees. Then something moved. Quick. Low. Darting between two rows of vehicles like smoke in the wind. It wasn't big, maybe the size of a person crouching, but it was fast. Too fast. The flashlight couldn't catch it, only illuminate the gaps it left behind. Then another shape. Taller. Still. Watching. Robert's voice came out low, almost a growl. "You see that?" Wireman didn't answer. But the truck's engine turned over a second later. They weren't running, but they weren't staying either. In going in, Robert muttered, the absurdity of it hitting him as he said it. But they had to check the lot. That was the job. Until they saw something that definitively said not to, orders were orders. He stepped through the gate. Every footfall felt like betrayal. His boots sank slightly into the soft gravel, the crunch far too loud in the weighted silence. He moved slowly, flashlight up, pistol down at low ready, sweeping left and right in arcs. The lot smelled old, rust and oil, mildew, dust, the faint tang of decaying rubber. Somewhere in the back, he could hear the creak of metal shifting. Not from wind. From weight. Pressure settling. Then, ahead and to the right, something scraped. Not a scream. Not a growl. A deliberate noise, metal on metal, like claws dragging across a car door. Robert froze again. The beam of his flashlight twitched, landed on a rust-pitted sedan. The paint was long gone, glass shattered out. And then, something rose behind it. Slowly. Uncoiling. It wasn't fully visible, only the shape, the suggestion. A hunched back, too high. Shoulders like stone. Long limbs. And then it dropped again, back behind the car. Robert took 3 steps back. We've got movement. Multiple. Wireman was already backing the truck toward the open gate. The spotlight caught another figure, just a blur this time, running along the far end of the lot. Upright. But wrong. Arms too long. Gait too heavy. Then the screaming started again. All at once. Like a cue had been given. From every direction, overlapping wails that weren't quite human and not quite animal either. Robert spun, nearly lost his footing. The ground seemed to tilt. Something about the way the sound hit him, disoriented, like vertigo, like falling upward. He staggered back through the gate, and the headlights caught him in full. Then something hit the fence. Hard. The entire structure shuddered, metal screeching under the impact. Wireman gunned the engine, headlights flaring as the truck jerked forward. Robert dove into the passenger seat, slamming the door just as a shadow loomed against the chain link. 12 feet tall, maybe more. Pressed against the fence, one massive hand wrapped around a steel support bar like it was a twig. The face, barely visible, glinted wet. Eyes low set, glowing dully, and filled with something Robert would later describe only as wrong. Wireman reversed hard, backing up onto the dirt road, tires spitting gravel. The thing didn't climb. It stepped back. And smiled. Robert saw it. Just for a second. Teeth like bone. Then it disappeared. They drove. Fast. Down the road, away from the lot. Robert kept his window open, flashlight aimed out. He didn't expect to see it again. But he did. Running alongside the fence, matching their speed. It didn't move like a man. Its arms didn't pump. Its head didn't bob. It just glided, legs driving like pistons, breath coming in guttural, snarling bursts that Robert heard over the sound of the engine. And then, it jumped. 12 feet straight up. Cleared the fence. The barbed wire snagged, slowed it, and it tumbled hard to the ground in a mass of limbs and fury. But even as it scrambled to stand, they were pulling away. They didn't stop until they reached the next checkpoint. Neither spoke for a long time. When they did, it wasn't about what it was. It was about what to say. What they'd have to say to avoid questions. The report would be simple: damaged fence, false alarm. Nothing else. Because if they told the truth, no one would believe it. And worse, someone might. And that, Robert thought, might be more dangerous. Because that scream. It wasn't fear. It was communication. Whatever was in that lot. It wasn't alone. And it wasn't finished. They didn't speak of it again that night. Not directly. Wireman drove the rest of their route in silence, hands tight on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror even when they were miles away from the lot. Robert sat next to him, flashlight clutched in his lap, sidearm still unholstered. Something had shifted in the air between them, a quiet agreement, forged not in words but in shock. They'd seen something they weren't supposed to see. Back at the station, they gave their debrief in clipped, formal terms. Fence damage. Nothing else. Standard patrol notes scribbled on a clipboard. No mention of the screaming. No mention of the thing that ran alongside them. Nothing about the barbed wire torn and twisted like string. Robert signed off the sheet and left without another word. But the silence didn't follow him home. It unraveled. The next few nights were quiet. The lot didn't appear on his schedule. Someone else got assigned to it, and Robert didn't ask who. He was back on central patrols, closer to base housing and admin blocks. Paved roads, overhead lighting, the low buzz of vending machines at checkpoints. Normalcy. But it didn't last. For days after the incident, he heard chatter in the locker room. A newer MP, kid named Travis, had come in for morning shift pale and sweaty. Said he thought he saw something on the edge of the lot. Big. Just a shadow. Nothing on the cameras. But he refused to go back out there alone. Robert didn't say anything at the time, but something clicked. It wasn't just a one-off. He started paying attention. To the shifts. To the scuttlebutt. To the unofficial notes passed between security details. There was a pattern forming, one that the official logs neatly avoided. Fence alarms going off in empty sectors. Motion lights that triggered without wind or animal interference. Radio static that rolled in just before 3 a.m., particularly near sectors 17 and 24. That's when Robert decided to dig. He began with the maps, base layouts, archived logs, even copies of the old utility schematics. Fort Campbell was massive, but it hadn't always been. A lot of the infrastructure predated the Vietnam era. There were buildings on the perimeter that hadn't been used since the 60s, some not even marked on the current operation maps. One, in particular, caught his attention. A maintenance shed listed as condemned, near the storage lot. It didn't appear on current duty routes. On a night when he wasn't scheduled, Robert borrowed a truck. He waited until the security station rotated shifts, midnight. Then he drove the old maintenance route himself, under the pretense of checking a sensor malfunction he fabricated in the system logs. He knew the gate code. He still had keys from his MP rotation. He parked just outside the shed, headlights off. The structure looked worse than he expected. Wood warped with time, roofing eaten by rust. The chain-link gate in front had been half pulled down, as if by something in a hurry. And the silence around it, deep, total, reminded him of the night in the lot. He stepped out, sidearm holstered, flashlight gripped tightly. The door hung open. Inside was dust, rot, and the smell of mold. But there were footprints. Big ones. Not boot prints. Not raccoon paws or stray dogs. These were deep. Bare. Human-shaped but far too large. Robert crouched, ran a finger along one. Still fresh. Still damp. The shed had a back wall that sloped into a hill. Once, it had been part of a larger compound. He could see where the structure had been collapsed, maybe intentionally. But someone, something, had clawed a hole through the rear. Earth had been dug away. Roots were torn, not cut. It was a tunnel. Descending. He didn't go in. Not yet. Instead, Robert returned the next day and started asking quiet questions. Not to command, to the old-timers. The retired staff sergeant still working logistics. The motor pool guys who'd been at Campbell since the 70s. They remembered rumors. Stories from the Vietnam-era soldiers who claimed to see things in the trees. Claims of large animals spotted on training routes, always dismissed as bears or mountain lions. One guy, a retired gunner named Miles, lowered his voice when Robert asked. There was a unit went missing back in '73, he said. Recon group. 5 guys. Last seen on a patrol near the old fuel depots. No bodies. Just a boot. And a rifle bent in half. Official cause. Navigation error. Heat stroke. But Miles didn't buy it. Base shut down that whole grid sector after. Fenced it off. Said it was for groundwater contamination. But that fence? It was the only one topped with razor coils. Robert listened. Took notes. pieced together the scraps. And then he went back. He returned to the tunnel under the old shed. This time, he brought a handheld camcorder, one of the old VHS ones from the media unit, and a mini tape recorder from the motor pool's lost and found. He brought fresh batteries, a spare flashlight, and a rope coiled over his shoulder. The tunnel dropped steeply. The smell of wet stone and something else, something sweet, metallic, like blood left in sunlight, grew stronger with each step. The walls narrowed, then opened again into a larger chamber, too dark for his beam to fully pierce. Then he heard breathing. Not his. Heavy. Measured. Close. He backed out fast. Didn't run, he knew better. But he walked with purpose, never turning his back. When he emerged, the sky had begun to lighten. The camcorder footage was mostly dark. But the last few frames, before he cut it, showed 2 pinpricks of light in the back of the chamber. Eye level. Watching. Back at his barracks, he hid the tape. Hid the recorder. He didn't report it. Because the army didn't believe in monsters. And neither did he. But something had followed them that night. Something was living in the bones of Fort Campbell. And Robert, he was no longer sure who else knew. Robert never forgot the face it made as it vaulted that 12-foot fence. Not because of the fear. But because of the intelligence behind the eyes. That moment, more than the screams, more than the impossible speed or the massive limbs, was the thing that stayed with him for decades. It wasn't an animal, at least not in the way we understand animals. It didn't just react. It judged. It watched. It chose. And it smiled. Years later, long after his discharge, after the nightmares stopped being nightly but never stopped entirely, Robert tried to find that lot again. Just to see it in the daylight. He returned to the base in 2002 for a reunion and took a detour, borrowing a car and driving out toward the old perimeter. But the road he remembered was gone. Not just overgrown, gone. He stopped at the gatehouse to ask about it, and the young guard, barely 20, gave him a blank look. "Sir, there's no junk lot back there." "Never was." Robert pressed. Described the fence, the layout, the buildings. Even the patrol route. Still, the guard insisted, there was nothing in that quadrant except closed-off training fields and natural preserves. Natural preserves. The word sank into his chest like a stone. Later, he managed to speak to an MP who'd been stationed there longer. The man hesitated when Robert brought it up, then offered a curious detail. "Yeah. That area is sealed off now. Some environmental risk thing. Land's unstable. Can't even drive a Humvee out there." But the tone in his voice didn't match the words. There was an undercurrent. Something unsaid. That night, Robert sat in his hotel room, flipping through old base schematics he'd printed out before the trip. The lot was there, on paper. Lot 19B. Vehicle Storage and Auxiliary Materials Depot. But on every modern map he could find, it was scrubbed. Erased. That entire corner of the base no longer had any official designation. Just listed as Sector D. And Sector D was off limits. That's when the weight of it settled in. It wasn't just that something terrifying had chased them that night, it was that someone knew. Someone knew, and covered it. But what they didn't count on was a memory that refused to die. Robert began digging. Quietly at first. Just veteran forums. Late-night messages. Half-buried discussion threads where guys used screen names instead of real names. He started to find patterns. Mentions of things seen on night patrols. Not from Fort Campbell alone, but from other bases. Fort Polk. Fort Drum. Even one from Okinawa. They all had a few things in common. Night patrol. Restricted zones. Silence before the event. And most disturbingly, memory loss. One man described waking up in the grass 50 yards from his last known position, weapon still slung but radio dead. Another swore he saw something hunched over a radio relay station, as if listening. And then, a strange post caught Robert's attention. A thread titled, "Night Things on the Fence Line," posted by a former security contractor who'd worked Fort Campbell in the early 2000s. He claimed he once reviewed surveillance footage from one of the remote gates after a motion trigger alert. The recording showed nothing, no movement, no breach. Just a flicker of static, and then 4 minutes gone. Clean cut. As if someone had simply deleted that portion of time. He wrote, "I don't know what freaked me out more. The missing footage, or the fact that command wasn't surprised. They just logged it as equipment error and moved on. Like it happens all the time." And then came the message. An anonymous email. No name. No return address. Just a single sentence. "They're not animals. They're listening." Attached was a blurry scan of what looked like an old field report, Japanese, typed, stamped with the seal of the Imperial Army. Translated, it read: Patrol encountered tall humanoid figures, estimated 2.5 meters in height. Movement quiet. Skin dark. Eyes glowing. 1 soldier killed, 2 missing. We withdrew. It was dated February 1943. Guadalcanal. Robert sat still for a long time after reading it. Because that was the first moment he considered it might not be isolated. That maybe, just maybe, it wasn't him who stumbled into their territory. But that they'd been watching soldiers for decades. For centuries. What if Fort Campbell wasn't chosen for its terrain, or its size, or its logistics? What if it was chosen because of what was already there? And what if some part of the army had known? Robert thought back to the way the base's outer lands were always underdeveloped. The thick forests, the overgrown zones, the old rumors about strange disappearances during training exercises that were quickly labeled heat stroke or misadventure. He remembered stories of a training squad that got lost in Sector D for 17 hours and emerged barely coherent, dehydrated, and refusing to talk. He remembered the way his chain of command never asked for a report. How no one even seemed interested in the damaged fence. He remembered how easily it was buried. The twist wasn't that monsters might be real. The twist was that the military might be using those monsters. Or at least, allowing them to stay. There's a saying in war zones, the map is not the territory. And on some nights, the territory doesn't belong to you. Robert didn't have proof. But he didn't need it. He had the memory. He had the scream. He had the moment it stared into his eyes, and the way it smiled, not like a predator. But like something that recognized him. Knew him. Had seen him before. And was waiting. Because maybe Fort Campbell wasn't haunted by something. Maybe Fort Campbell was housing something. And whatever it wasn't done. To make sense of what happened that night, Robert did what any trained soldier would do, he broke it down. Piece by piece. Location. Timing. Movement. Behavior. Not because it would help him sleep better, but because it was the only way he knew how to survive the memory. He started with the lot itself. Lot 19B, they called it. A forgotten graveyard of rusted vehicles and old gear, hemmed in by barbed wire and indifference. On paper, it was just a storage zone. But something didn't sit right. Why keep a lot full of junk cars from Vietnam-era deployments locked and guarded for over a decade? Why not scrap them, clear the land, reassign the space? Robert came to believe the lot wasn't being protected from the outside, it was keeping something in. Or worse, it was bait. Think about it, long-term storage, buildings barely touched in years, a location remote enough for secrecy but still within base bounds. If something, some entity, was known to dwell in the perimeter, wouldn't it make sense to guide it? To contain its range? To control it, however loosely? The scream. That's what Robert returned to most often. It didn't sound like a bear. Not a cougar. Not a man in distress. It sounded layered, inhuman vocal cords pushed to their limit, like a predator taunting its prey. It didn't cry out when it first saw them. It waited. Watched. And then, when the gate opened and Robert stepped inside, it let loose. That was the moment of engagement. He theorized that the first creature was a scout. Watching. Observing from behind the junk cars. Its movements were too deliberate. Staying out of the light. Crouching, flanking. When Robert opened the gate, the signal was given. And then came the others. Robert estimated at least 5, maybe 6 different sources of the screams. All coordinated. All in proximity. They didn't charge immediately. They announced themselves. Established dominance. Gave Robert and Wireman a moment to run. Why? Because that, Robert believed, was part of the game. It wasn't a chaotic attack. It was structured. Measured. As though these things weren't hunting for food, they were hunting for information. Behaviorally, what Robert saw that night didn't match any known animal. It ran on 2 legs, but didn't swing its arms. It moved upright, with a stiff posture. Its strength was immense, keeping pace with a military-grade vehicle on rough terrain. And it was smart enough to attempt a leap over barbed wire rather than finding another exit. He replayed the chase in his head. The creature had no reason to pursue them once they were inside the truck. No reason to expose itself. And yet it did. Ran alongside them. Made eye contact. Showed them its form. It wanted to be seen. That, more than anything, shattered Robert's assumptions. This wasn't an accidental encounter. It was an intentional demonstration. The leap over the fence, so visibly aggressive, so reckless, wasn't an escape. It was a message. It could get in. And out. Later, he mapped the route. The lot, the road, the fence. Estimated how fast the truck was moving when the creature kept pace. Based on engine strain and road conditions, he guessed 30 to 35 miles per hour. That's beyond any human's capability. Beyond most quadrupeds. And yet, it ran. At 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair, this thing should have lumbered. It didn't. It sprinted with purpose. And then there was its gaze. Robert swore it looked straight at him through the open window. Not just tracking him. Reading him. No reflection in the eyes. No animal gleam. Just a flat, primal intelligence. A sentience that chilled him more than its size. That's when the pieces began to align. There had been stories, old stories, passed around between soldiers on base. About strange figures in the woods. Screams heard near the ranges. Once, an entire platoon training exercise was paused after unconfirmed howling triggered a panic. Officially, it was logged as equipment interference and a training mishap. But men remembered. Robert came to believe that whatever these things were, they had always been there. Long before the army. Long before the fences. Perhaps even before the towns. He looked into the land's history. The woods beyond Fort Campbell were once Cherokee hunting grounds. Early settlers had claimed devils lived in the trees. In the 1950s, farmers near the base reported livestock vanishing, massive tracks in the mud, fences twisted like ribbon. Most of it was ignored. Coincidence. Folklore. But Robert no longer believed in coincidences. He formed a working theory: Fort Campbell wasn't haunted. It was cohabited. The creatures were territorial, not predatory. They didn't attack randomly. They engaged only when provoked or encroached upon. The rusted car lot wasn't their nest, but it was on their edge. A liminal space. And that night, Robert stepped too far in. He began to see the incident as less of a chase and more of a ritual. A test. The creatures didn't maul them. Didn't drag them into the woods. They could have. But they didn't. Instead, they showed themselves. Why? Maybe as a warning. Maybe as a show of power. Maybe, Robert thought grimly, because they wanted him to remember. And remember he did. In the years that followed, he watched the patterns continue. Reports from other bases. Creepy stories buried in the margins of military folklore. Common themes: remote sectors, night patrols, silence before movement, intelligence behind the eyes. He didn't think the army was hiding a monster problem. It was deeper than that. This was coexistence by silence. Unwritten rules. Don't build here. Don't go there. Keep your eyes forward and your mouth shut. And if you see something? No, you didn't. Reconstructing the night with wiremen, Robert realized something else. There had been no follow-up. No search party. No questioning. No one even asked why their patrol time was off. Either no one noticed, or someone made sure not to ask. Robert began to wonder if some part of the command structure already knew. Not in the way movies show, with labs and experiments, but in the quiet, complicit way that organizations ignore things too big to explain. As the years passed, he never reported the incident. But the memory stayed. And now, with decades of distance, had come to one terrifying, if unprovable, conclusion. The creatures weren't intruding. They weren't accidents. They were part of the territory. And the army, knowingly or not, had built its fences around something ancient. Not to contain it. But to leave it alone. Absolutely. Here's the immersive, Doubt B breakdown section, continuing the emotional and narrative trajectory of the Fort Campbell story. It's strange what memory chooses to keep. Not the shape of the creature. Not the exact way it moved or the guttural sound it made when it breathed. Not even the hair-raising scream that had shattered the silence of the Kentucky night. No. What Robert remembered most vividly was the silence after. The kind of silence that didn't feel like an absence, but a warning. A pressure. A presence you couldn't see, but couldn't unfeel. And in the weeks that followed, that silence followed him. It lingered. Even after sunrise returned the world to normal. Even after the daily routines resumed and the base resumed its cold, mechanical rhythm. No one else knew. Not his superior officers. Not the soldiers he passed in the mess hall. Not the clerks behind the admin desk who signed his daily logs with half-hearted glances. To everyone else, it was just another quiet patrol on another uneventful night. But Robert knew better. And worse, so did wiremen. They didn't talk about it. Not even in passing. Not when they shared a meal in the mess or nodded at each other across the barracks lot. The silence wasn't an agreement, it was survival. Like they both understood instinctively that speaking of what they'd seen was dangerous in a way neither of them could articulate. But silence doesn't stop memory. Robert began losing sleep. The first week, he chalked it up to adrenaline. The second, to overthinking. By the third, he stopped trying to explain it. The dreams were always the same, him alone on the perimeter fence, his flashlight flickering, the beam barely cutting through the dark, and then that sound. That scream again. Except in the dream, it didn't end. It just stretched. Like a wire pulled tighter and tighter, until it felt like it was slicing through his skull. He started avoiding the junk lot altogether. Swapped shifts with guys who didn't care for the back routes, offered to take on extra work near the motor pool or south perimeter. Anything to keep him away from that spot. But it didn't work. Because the thing wasn't just out there anymore. It was in him. And what terrified him more than anything else was how quickly the memory of the creature had started to feel distant, uncertain. Like a story he'd heard, not something he lived. The images were still sharp, yes, but they began to swim in doubt. Had it really been that tall? Had it really looked at him? Had it really jumped the fence? He knew it had. He swore it had. But the longer he stayed silent, the more that certainty began to decay. One morning, still groggy from another sleepless night, he stared at himself in the mirror and asked out loud, "What if I imagined it?" He meant it sarcastically. Meant it to be rhetorical. But the question didn't go away. He stopped eating much. Fell behind on his fitness metrics. Even missed a comms check once, his first strike in years. His platoon sergeant didn't grill him too hard, just warned him to get his head back in the game. Robert nodded and promised he would. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, he wasn't sure his head had come back from that fence line. It was the night wireman caught him that finally broke something. Robert had gone back. He didn't know why. Couldn't explain it. One moment, he was finishing an admin report in the comms trailer. The next, he was driving the OD green SUV down toward the old storage lot, alone. Maybe it was obsession. Maybe it was just a need for closure. Or maybe it was something the creature left behind. A feeling. A call. He parked just shy of the gate. The barbed wire had been repaired weeks ago, new coils gleaming silver under the moonlight. The padlock looked identical to the one from that night, but his hand shook as he reached for it. He didn't have a key. Didn't need one. The gate swung open on its own. Robert stepped back, breath caught in his throat. It wasn't until the beam of another vehicle swept over him that he turned, and saw Wireman. The truck came to a sharp stop, and Wireman jumped out, eyes wide. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed. Robert didn't answer. Because he didn't know. Because in that moment, he wasn't even sure who he was trying to be, soldier, survivor, or witness. Wireman pulled him back, not gently. "Don't come here again," he said. Whatever it was. We weren't supposed to see it. And there it was again. That unspoken thread of understanding. They both knew. They just didn't know what. Was it some classified experiment? Some breed of animal the government kept buried in its black book of secrets? Was it extraterrestrial? Spiritual? Something from folklore that had bled into the present? Or was it just madness? Because what haunted Robert more than the creature itself was this: if something that big could move that fast, think that clearly, track them that deliberately, then how many others had seen it? How many hadn't lived to tell? And how many had stayed silent, just like him? The answers never came. And the silence grew louder. Years have passed. Decades, even. And still, there are nights when Robert wakes up gasping for air, heart pounding, ears straining in the dark, listening for a sound he prays never returns. The scream. It's not just a memory anymore. It's a presence, etched into the folds of his brain, sitting just behind his eyes like a shadow waiting for dusk. By now, he's learned to live with it. Like a scar. You stop noticing it after a while. Until you brush up against it in the mirror or a dream or a passing silence too deep to be natural. Then it throbs all over again. Like a truth your body remembers even when your mind tries to forget. He never told the VA. Never told his family. Sometimes he's not even sure he really told himself. But he knows. There are certain truths you don't need validation for. You don't need science or satellite imagery or grainy video footage on a late-night TV segment. You just need the weight of it. The undeniable heaviness that it leaves in your soul. The way the world feels different afterward. Thinner, maybe. Or sharper. After that night, Fort Campbell wasn't just a military base to him anymore. It was a border. A place where two worlds touched. One filled with concrete, code words, and chain of command. The other. Something older. Raw. Untamed. Something that still had teeth. It changes how you see the world. How you walk through it. How you listen to it. He remembers returning to that fence line weeks later, this time in daylight. The sun was high, the birds chirping. The wind carried the scent of pine and cut grass. It was all too normal. Deceptively so. But the fence was still bent. The barbed wire had been coiled anew, yes, but the shape of the gate had never fully returned to form. Like the metal remembered being touched by something with hands too big, too strong, too deliberate. No one else noticed. No one else cared. But Robert stood there, staring at it, and thought, this is where the world cracked. He doesn't claim to understand what they saw. He doesn't offer answers. He doesn't even chase them anymore. He knows that some truths don't want to be found. That some questions aren't there to be solved, but to remind us we're not as safe as we pretend to be. And maybe we never were. There's a silence that lives at the edges of military bases. Not the kind born of discipline or order, but of history. Ghosts. Legends. The land remembers things the paperwork forgets. Things buried beneath acronyms and denied in briefings. Fort Campbell was one such place. And Robert? He's one of the few left who remembers. He often thinks about what would have happened if the creature had reached them. What its plan was. If it had a plan. It didn't kill them that night. Didn't even try to breach the fence outright. But it followed. Watched. Ran alongside. Measured them. That's what haunts him most, the sense that it wasn't a random encounter. It was a test. And they passed. Barely. Wireman retired a few years after. Moved out west. They haven't spoken in years. Maybe that's for the best. Shared silence doesn't always lead to shared healing. Robert never went back to Fort Campbell after his discharge. Never took the highway that ran past the training areas. Never revisited the lot. He says he wouldn't even recognize it now. But he would. He knows he would. He still dreams of that fence. And once in a while, when he wakes in a cold sweat, heart hammering, pulse climbing, he swears he hears something in the trees outside his home. Just for a moment. A shift. A wait. A breath. And he lies there, motionless, counting the seconds between silence and certainty. He never hears it twice. But that's the thing about fear. You only need to hear it once to never forget how loud it was. The woods are quiet now. At least, that's what Robert tells himself when the wind dies down and the sky hangs low, full of memory. He walks slower these days. Doesn't carry a weapon. Doesn't wear the uniform. But some part of him, the part that still feels the gravel of Fort Campbell's back roads under his boots, never left the job. Some nights, he finds himself standing on his back porch, staring into the dark tree-line behind his home. Listening. Not for owls or coyotes. For silence. That charged, pregnant silence. The kind that doesn't just mean something is absent, but that something is watching. Because it's never what you hear that scares you. It's what you don't. The gate at Fort Campbell was replaced years ago. The records don't mention anything unusual. The logbooks say the wire was damaged during routine patrol. Vandalism, probably. The report was signed off, filed, forgotten. But not by him. Because the creature never came out of the woods again. Not in his lifetime. Not that he knows of. But what if that was never the point? What if it wasn't about the attack? What if it was about the warning? That possibility, the idea that they weren't hunted, but warned, has nested in the corners of Robert's mind like mold. Growing in silence. Feeding on everything left unsaid. What if the screams weren't threats, but signals? What if what he saw that night was not the main threat, but only the edge of something larger? A scout. A guardian. A sentry. It wasn't the size of the creature that frightened him the most. It wasn't the way it moved, or the sound it made when it ran. It was the eyes. Not wild. Not confused. Not afraid. Calculating. That look has never left him. And yet, no one believes him. Not officially. Not in writing. Wireman never spoke up. Robert didn't either. Because they knew what would happen. What does happen? No one wants monsters in the margins of military records. There's no form for that. No clearance for what they saw. But in the years that followed, Robert quietly tracked the stories. Unconfirmed sightings in other bases. Brief mentions on obscure radio broadcasts. Cases of missing soldiers written off as desertion or accidents. He traced the patterns. Not openly. Just enough to know one thing for sure. It wasn't just Fort Campbell. There are other places. Other stories. But the endings are always the same, open, fractured, silenced. He read a report once, long buried in an army archive. Redacted names. Half-finished sentences. It mentioned unexplained casualties in a training area in Northern California. The final paragraph referenced a humanoid silhouette and the appearance of coordinated pursuit. No follow-up report was ever filed. Just like his. The military keeps secrets. Everyone knows that. But this isn't a conspiracy. It's worse. It's indifference. Not everything is buried because it's unbelievable. Some things are buried because no one wants to believe them. So where does that leave him? An aging veteran with a haunted story and no answers. No resolution. No closure. Just one night in 1988. One scream in the dark. One thing running beside a truck faster than anything should. That's the part that breaks him still, how fast it was. And how it never tripped. No stumbling. No second thoughts. Just intention. The kind you don't forget. He stopped trying to explain it. Stopped hoping for confirmation or vindication. The truth is too tangled now, too mixed with memory and disbelief. But sometimes, when the wind shifts and the crickets fall silent, he remembers what it felt like to be watched from just beyond the tree line. To know, with a certainty so complete it burned in his chest, that something was out there. Something bigger than him. Something older than the base. And maybe something still waiting. Because the forest hasn't changed. The road is still there. And the gate? It still swings shut on its own. That's the truth he lives with. That some stories don't end. They just stop being told.